Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the Procurement Act 2023, 1 year on, and what it means for schools and trusts. So we're really pleased to have you with us, and over the next half an hour, we'll take a clear and practical look at how the first year of the Act has played out in real school and maths settings, what's working well, where the challenges are, and what you'll need to prioritise as we move into the next phase of implementation. If you do have any questions at any point, please feel free to pop them into the chat and we'll pick them up as we go along or at the end of the session if time allows. And I'm delighted to introduce you today to Nathan. Good morning, Nathan.
Good morning, Victoria. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Excellent.
And Nathan will be leading us through the key changes, lessons learned, and the most important actions schools and trusts should be taking 1 year on from the Procurement Act 2023 going live. So thank you again for being with us this morning, and I'll hand you over to Nathan to get started.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victoria. Yeah, we won't take loads of time this morning, but it's good just to reflect. 1 year on, folks. Who can believe it? Well, not quite 1 year, actually. The Procurement Act 23 came in around about 29th of February 2025. So we're sort of 11 months and a few days, but let's call it a year. We won't split hairs on that. So yes, the Act had an interesting start. Like I say, can't believe it's 1 year. The Act has very much been on a lot of people's minds since then, and yeah, there's been a lot of activity, crazy, frantic activity, particularly in the public sector with regards to the Procurement Act. But what has it meant for schools? And that's what we're going to cover today. So just going into the depths of the Act itself. So what is the new Procurement Act? Not so new now, but like I said, the Procurement Act came into force end of February 2025, so we're nearly 1 year on, and it unified a number of public procurement regulations into one unified procurement regulation. So that probably doesn't mean much to schools, but in terms of the wider public sector, that simplified things quite a lot. One of the main implications for the Act was simplified procurement routes. So procedures that you must follow went down to about 3 different choices within the Procurement Act itself. So that enabled a much more simple process, a choice of procedures to undertake, and obviously enabled schools to have a much clearer view as to what process to follow. There is more transparency notices. So one of the key updates to the Procurement Act is we went from about 3 or 4 notices up to about 13, 14 notices that are required. What are notices? These are public notices that you have to place in what's called the central digital platform to notify of a tender opportunity, how that procurement is being run, what the process is, basically contract award notices, contract details notices, lots of different notices. So transparency is a real key part of the new Procurement Act, and that's had a major impact, particularly a positive impact, in fact, on the market, the wider market, and suppliers that have got more access to information about public procurement. But it certainly requires a lot more planning and preparation. We'll come on to that. The central digital platform is the single portal for placing those notices. And again, that was part of launching the Act as well. The new procurement review unit and the supplier debarment process, again, is new as part of the new Procurement Act. So the procurement review unit is there to review, as it says, and audit procurements that are undertaken, but also it has the power to review suppliers from a debarment basis. So if a supplier is not performing in a public contract, or there has been some sort of issue, then they have the power to effectively bar suppliers from future public contracts. So that is quite a step up and quite a significant change under the new Procurement Act rules. Frameworks are still included, so those familiar with framework arrangements, they're still very much a feature and part of the Procurement Act, but there is a new open framework route where you can periodically add new suppliers to your framework as required, which is great for those frameworks which, for whatever reason, become a bit stale or need new suppliers to join the framework without having to completely reprocure it. So that is an interesting and increasingly popular route to market. And dynamic purchasing systems are still a feature, but they're now called dynamic markets. Minimal change on those, but a bit of terminology change. And then finally, the new National Procurement Policy Statement, which sits alongside the new Procurement Act and which covers a number of broader requirements around social value and sustainability and other aspects around economic inclusion and other sustainability matters. So again, that's something that you must have regard to when procuring. So this isn't a training session, folks, on the new Procurement Act. We do run an in-depth session on the new Procurement Act, but it was just a sort of a top level sort of what are the key changes, what are the updates, the headlines on the new Procurement Act. You may be aware that the public procurement thresholds recently changed, so they are updated every 2 years. So previously in January 2024, if you was purchasing goods and services on behalf of your MAT or your school, then a estimated whole life, and it's a whole life cost value over £214,000 there or thereabouts, you would have to undertake a open tender process or an above threshold process in full accordance with what was then the Public Contract Regulations 2015. Now that has been slightly reduced to 207,720, and that is for that is for goods and services. The works contract value, so if you was undertaking, let's say, a capital works scheme, then that is now 5.1 million, down from 5.3. So it's capturing ever more procurement by value into the full requirements of the Procurement Act. Not a vast change to the thresholds, but just to note, those thresholds do include VAT. So it can easily hit those figures where, for argument's sake, you've got an annual cleaning contract at £100,000. It's a services contract. It's a 4-year contract, so you would value that at £400,000 plus any extensions. So you can easily hit some of those thresholds. So what we're finding is schools and trusts are seeing more and more of their procurements caught by the full rigor of the regulations, and what that means is a requirement to undertake one of those 3 procedures, and fully follow the transparency requirements around those notices, etc., which we'll come on to. So what are schools experiencing so far? Well, over the last year, we've done quite a lot of work with a number of multi-academy trusts, and I've been up and down the country engaging with schools and trusts. The headline sort of positives are that the Act encourages earlier market engagement. So one of the requirements in the Act is, or one of the opportunities within the Act is pushing on what's called preliminary market engagement. So this is where, prior to a tender process, you can publish a preliminary market engagement notice, which is a notice announcing that you are engaging with the market to help shape and test your specifications, your requirements, seek innovation before you go out to tender. So it's a way of getting feedback from the market on a proposed procurement. Very powerful, very useful, and most of the successful procurements I've been involved in have always been preceded by what we call a PME, or a preliminary market engagement. So where that is done, that is improving competition, and generally across the wider sector, a lot of PMEs are happening, and that's giving the market good opportunity to see what's coming through and improving competition. Clearer documentation, yes, it's still procedural, and yes, there are still things that you have to do, but the Act does clear up a number of areas, and particularly enables you to choose procedures and design a procurement. But again, you've got to make sure that it's clear, unambiguous, and transparent. And that sort of requirement is reducing the challenge risk, whereas before, in some cases, it could be quite confusing, but certainly under the new Act, it's quite clear as to what's required, and therefore the challenge risk will be reduced as a result. And just generally, I found the profile and the benefits of procurement itself has been raised in the sector. Procurement, I would even say 5-10 years ago, was very much thought of as a back office function, maybe part of finance, but these days it is a strategic function in its own right. And certainly that is as a result of some of the risks around compliance, but also some of the benefits in terms of the transparency, in terms of competition, in terms of cost savings that can be achieved through better procurement. We're seeing a lot more engagement, and in fact, I'm seeing a lot more job roles come up around procurement, particularly in the MAT sector. So it shows that MATs are certainly taking procurement more seriously now, and as a result of the Act, obviously it's making everyone sit up and take notice a bit more. Some of the challenges we've found: time pressures around the requirement to publish lots of different notices within a procurement, time pressure with regards to planning procurement, knowing what's coming up. If you don't have a forward procurement plan, that could be quite a challenge, because obviously the Act will require you to be very well prepared, and we'll come on to that around what you've got coming up in the coming year or 2 years around replacement of contracts, reprocurement of contracts, etc. So time is going to be a challenge for those who are ill prepared when it comes to procurement. That is forcing a review of procurement strategy and policy, and that's kind of linked to the profile of procurement. But hitherto, procurement hasn't necessarily had its own strategy or policy. It's maybe part of the financial regulations of a trust or a school, and certainly we've found that with the opportunities but also complexity of procurement, there is an increasing need to make sure that policies are updated, and part of that, a trust has a procurement strategy, so it knows what it's got from a procurement planning standpoint for in the years ahead. All that is putting pressure on limited internal capacity for change and the requirement to upskill colleagues. There's still not many professional procurement people that work in schools and MATs, understandably so. And so a lot of that responsibility falls to finance, to school business managers, in some cases to heads and principals. So again, that's quite a challenge, because again, the Act, does require quite a bit of review and consideration, and you need to be on top of best practice, and that can cause a bit of a capacity shortfall. And crucially, having spend and contracts visibility is becoming increasingly essential. So if you're not sure as to who you're spending with, or what your contracts are in terms of start and end dates, estimated values, etc., notice periods for termination, all that sort of stuff, it's going to be increasingly difficult to remain compliant with the Act. And that is because of the transparency requirements, but also because of the lead time for reprocurement. So again, one of the things that I'm working with a number of trusts is around spend analysis and contracts registers to just gain better visibility as to how procurement is done, or what contracts are in place within a trust, so you can be better planned, better prepared to meet the requirements of the Act. There is obviously updated terminology in the Act. I mean, one of the ones that I just picked out was something called the Competitive Flexible Procedure, or CFP. So in the previous regulations, you had a choice of procedures. You may be familiar with restricted or competitive dialogue or negotiated. Well, one of the positives of the Act is it has enabled contracting authorities to design their own procurement process. Which I won't go into in terms of examples, but again, if you're interested in that more, then we do a full training session on the Procurement Act. But this has enabled MATs to really think properly about their procurements and have a good procurement strategy for certain categories. Certain categories may benefit from a different route to market or a different type of competitive procedure. So again, the flexibility is there. We still have the open procedure, which is what is where you go out to tender and advertise, and you receive as many tenders as interest is given. But again, it is a bit more of a simplified process under the Procurement Act. So again, just some updated terminology there. So key lessons from year one. Updated procurement policy and strategy is key, as I've mentioned. If you haven't reviewed your procurement policy in a while, I can guarantee it will be out of date at this point, since the Act came in last year. So it's a good idea to review that. If you don't have a procurement policy and it's part of the financial regulations, then that's not necessarily an issue, but as long as the inclusions within the financial regulations take into account all the requirements of the Act. But I would argue it is better to now consider, if you don't have it, a standalone procurement policy, and that is certainly something that we've been helping quite a number of trusts and MATs over the last year or so. Transition takes time. It's going to take time to get your head around all of this. It has been live for a year, but it's recognizing that it does take a few years for contracts to wash through in terms of being reprocured. So if you've got existing contracts that are in place, you've maybe not had to reprocure anything since the Act's come in. So it does take a bit of time to sort of wash through, but again, using that time to prepare, to review process and update templates, etc. So when you do come to reprocure, which would have to be done through the requirements of the new Act, then you've got that foundation, you've got that preparation. The Act has forced a review of procurement, what we call operating models in MAT. So just to explain this, quite a number of MATs still operate what's called basically a split procurement model, where each school is responsible for their own procurement. That's quite common. It's a disaggregated model where if you've got schools that have been joining your MAT recently or over the last few years, it might be that they've continued with their own contracts or continued with their own procurement. However, one of the things that the Act is sort of forcing now is a review based on, a MAT helicopter view of procurement. So what we look at is more of a centre-led model in terms of procurement from the standpoint of policy and strategy, but also in looking at opportunities to aggregate contracts. So I was at a MAT not long ago where they had lots of different contracts for photocopiers, whereas as the Act, it would judge your MAT as one contracting authority for a start, and therefore the spend on photocopiers would warrant a single procurement approach. I appreciate in practice that's not always easy, but certainly it's forcing that review of how procurement is looked at a MAT level, and that in itself is aligned with how your policy is written, what your strategy is, and how you're training and building capacity, which is the next one. So There's been a lot of training support out there. The government commercial college has done quite a lot of training. There's the DFE that's got training and information out there. We've done a lot of training. So again, it's just making sure that you have someone that is the lead person for procurement, ideally, and that they have as much training as possible around the requirements of the Act, so that again you're not caught out by the requirements. Again, key lessons from year one: the central digital platform is transforming visibility. So as mentioned, there's a lot more notices that are placed there now, not just in terms of the initial procurement, but also in terms of contract management and how a contract is performing. Even to the extent of when a contract is terminated, there is a new requirement to place a notice informing there. So again, that's transforming visibility, and that requires Mats to be more on top of contract management than ever, particularly if you've procured a contract through the new Procurement Act. It will require you to be on top of things like performance reviews and supplier engagement, so that you can notify of any issues. Again, this goes back to that supplier debarment and that procurement review unit. So again, contract management is really important. Communication across the MAT, and particularly at SLT level, is essential to ensure that everyone's aware of the lead times for procurement, of the requirements of the Act, etc., and just to be aware of the profile of procurement now, and how important procurement is. Having strong documentation and a rationale for choosing certain routes to market is essential. So again, everything you do needs to be recorded and justified as part of transparency. But having strong templates for things like tender documents and award notices and things like that is really key to make sure you're compliant with the Act. Forward planning remains essential. So what have you got coming up in the next year to re-procure? What contracts are expiring? What do you intend to extend? Can you extend under the Act, etc., etc.? So again, just having that forward visibility. The worst case is that you've not got that visibility, and all of a sudden you've got 2 weeks' notice on a quite a sizable contract, and you wouldn't have time to re-procure it under the Act. The Act will be quite unforgiving when it comes to unplanned or, poor planning when it comes to re-procurement, simply because of the transparency requirements. Small, medium enterprises and new entrants are finding it better visibility because of all the new transparency, because of increased pre-market engagement, pre-procurement engagement. So again, reports back is that small, medium businesses are engaging better with public procurement, and again, certainly schools and MAT do engage with lots of small, medium enterprises and local providers in certain categories, and that's a good thing, and certainly something that the Act encourages. And there's still very much strategic and cultural shifts. Seeing procurement as not just a process to endure, but an enabler of outcomes, wider outcomes such as things like social value and community benefits, which align with the National Procurement Policy Statement. So again, procurement is much more than just buying stuff and getting contracts in. There is a much bigger agenda around that now, and it's the power of procurement and your spend profile which can really make a difference. And we've seen some really good social value outcomes coming out of recent procurements around environmental, social, community benefits. And schools and MATs, I always say, are uniquely placed. You're at the heart of the community. There is lots of good that you can do through your contract through there. So what does good compliance look like? Well, having defined procurement workflows and processes is key. That links back to having that up-to-date procurement policy and up-to-date templates. So request for quotation forms, invitation to tender forms, evaluation forms. There is quite a lot out there already, and I know the Cabinet Office have put out some really good templates. So you don't always have to design those from scratch. There is good practice ones already available. But again, that's enabling you to remain compliant, that you've got everything included within those documents for when you do your tenders and when you do your procurements under the Act. Ensuring published notices are completed accurately and on time. As mentioned, there's lots of new notices, transparency notices required, covering the whole procurement cycle from planned procurement notices, where you're just simply informing the market of a future potential procurement, through to a tender notice, where you're notifying of the launch of a tender process itself, through to contract award notices and contract details notices, and then contract performance notices. So if you're feeling a little bit on edge with all of that, then yes, I think that's understandable, because the number of notices have vastly increased, and all of that is put through the new central digital platform. So if you don't have someone that's on top of that and managing that through your procurements, then again, that's going to be a compliance issue. Having that forward plan and contracts register, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's all good, is key, to make sure that you give yourself lead time for procurement, because certainly above threshold procurement now, I mean, it can take months and needs careful consideration. So as mentioned previously, having 2 weeks notice to reprocure a major contract is not going to wash. You need to be giving yourself at least 6 months notice, and that enables you to think clearly, have clear justifications for choosing certain routes to market and certain procurement procedures. It enables you to have time to really consider the evaluation process and how you will score bids and suppliers, and also enables you to factor in market engagement if you want to test some assumptions, and if you want to test a specification before you go out to tender, or just warm up the market for interest and hopefully future increased competition. So again, time is your best friend when it comes to the Procurement Act, and having that forward plan is really going to be key. So the two takeaways from this slide really are policy and templates and workflows, and forward planning. Two really key things. If you get those two things nailed, then you're in a better place to ensure better compliance. In terms of the policies, it's updating your procurement policy around the new Procurement Act terminology. As we've just seen, the thresholds have recently been updated, so you might want to review those in if they're mentioned in any of your existing financial regs or policies, and again how that impacts approval to award and delegated authorities for award of contracts. Refreshing templates and evaluation methodologies is going to be key to make sure that, again, the terminology of the Procurement Act, it talks about assessment summaries, it talks about exclusion criteria or excludable criteria. So again, it's just making sure that your templates are fit for purpose and aligned with the new Act. I mentioned earlier around defining responsibilities. So again, who is the lead person for procurement? That might be you on the webinar today. And if that's the case, congratulations, well done. I think certainly making sure that that person has defined responsibilities for things like publication of notices, etc., is going to be key. So that one person is on top of that. And again, just embedding contract management now. I think a lot of challenges we've seen over the years has been around actually the contract management stage of the procurement cycle, and a let and forget mentality, as we call it. Once we've got through the tender, everything's fine, we've survived that, we can just leave the supplier to get on with it. But certainly under the Act now, as mentioned, with new transparency notices, that's going to be a key requirement to maintain management and oversight of contracts that have been procured under the Act, and not to leave it to an afterthought. So practical tips 1 year on from the new Act. So It's useful to keep a compliance calendar for notices and deadlines that can be linked to your forward procurement plan. So for each of your procurements that you've got coming up, I would recommend a procurement project calendar or timetable, which clearly defines what you need to do and when those notices are required, particularly for the contract stage. Quick reference guides for staff who may not be who procure occasionally. They may not be the lead on some big procurements, but certainly just making sure that they've got an awareness of the requirements of the Act. Typically, what I would say is that they need to engage with any forward planning, so they notify you, if you're the lead person for this, that they're aware of a procurement coming up. As mentioned, it doesn't take a lot for some of those thresholds to be reached, particularly now that the thresholds have been slightly reduced. So you could easily find that a procurement now is caught under the full requirements of the Act, and therefore you'll need more time to re-procure that. Training budget holders is key, but obviously proportionality and transparency is part of that, in terms of, they might not need to know the full requirements of the Act, and we don't want to necessarily worry them, but certainly being aware of some of the key requirements is key. And we've done quite a lot of training with school business managers and budget holders across a number of trusts. And the main penny that drops is, okay, time is my friend. I need to notify of upcoming procurement so that we've got time to re-procure. If you don't have a central contracts register, then I would strongly recommend you have one in place, and within that, identify which contracts are under the PCR 15 regulations, and obviously which contracts are under the PA 23 regulations, because the PA 23 regulations, as we know, will require more transparency notices at contract stage. So it's being on top of that. So we are in a period of transition where you'll have contracts under dual regimes, and that can be a bit confusing. But basically, anything that you procure now from this point, from February 29th last year, has to be procured under the Procurement Act 23. So having a central contracts register that just separates those out, but also gives you visibility of when contracts are ending, notice periods, etc., so that you can plan a re-procurement in good time without leaving it to the last minute, is going to be essential. Again, just reviewing lessons learned across the trust. How is procurement? Take the temperature of procurement in your trust. Are we doing okay? Are we struggling? A bit of a maturity review is helpful, and sometimes just doing a bit of a survey across those who are engaged in procurement or managing contracts is welcomed, just to get a view as to, okay, are things clear? A process is clear? Is the policy clear, etc.? And again, as mentioned previously, a lot of trusts still operate quite a decentralized model for procurement, where each school does their own thing. Again, it's just about ensuring that the trust now is looking at its responsibilities to compliance as a whole trust and not just as individual schools. The use of external frameworks, existing contracts that have been procured by what's called public sector buying organisations, is still perfectly valid as a route to market, and often will negate the need to undertake a full tender process. So those are very much still recommended when capacity is low, but I would always argue, as long as they're fit for purpose, as long as you are scoped in as a MAT. So just make sure that any frameworks that you're looking at are open to the education sector, and also that they're fit for purpose for what you're looking to purchase. So if it doesn't meet your need, then it's not a viable solution. But there are lots of good frameworks out there, and I would strongly encourage you to consider those. And they cover quite a wide majority of categories that a typical MAT or school would purchase, from stationery to management information systems to cleaning, catering, audit, payroll, etc. Of which education buying, we have a number of those frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems. So you don't have to do a full tender process. And with that comes a shortened lead time for procurement. But again, having a forward procurement plan and a contracts register will enable you to identify upfront what categories of what procurements and what contracts you would be more suitable as a route to market via an external framework, as opposed to a bespoke tender, as we call it. In some cases, a bespoke tender is your only option, and in that case, obviously, it's then ensuring that you know what the procedure is to do that. So we have some training coming up, which may be of interest. Created a procurement policy that's fit for purpose. So that's an in-depth review of basically updating your procurement policy in line with the new Procurement Act. So that's been quite a popular one. And if you haven't reviewed your policy in the last year, then I would strongly recommend this as a training opportunity. We have contract management and supplier due diligence. So what does good practice contract management look like? How do you manage suppliers? What do you do when there's issues and problems, etc.? How do you manage those? And then we have a much more in-depth session on the Procurement Act. I appreciate it's been very top level today, so apologies for that, but certainly we have a much more in-depth Procurement Act training session, which is about just under 3 hours, that will really tease out and go into the details of what the Procurement Act requires and what's involved in that.
Thanks
Folks,
again,
sorry for going over time. It's obviously quite a lot to wrap into a short webinar. I do encourage you to have a look at the training though, where we can go into a lot more detail. We try and keep our costs down for that. There is a nominal cost to join, but we try and keep it as low as possible for schools, because we want to ensure that schools are well equipped for procurement going forward. Okay, so thank you very much for your time this morning, folks. Have a good weekend.
Cheers.